Steven Spielberg has directed some of the most financially successful films in the history of cinema, won multiple Academy Awards, and built a filmography that spans nearly 6 decades. Yet the one skill his peers rarely discuss openly is the one that sits at the core of everything he makes: reading a human being before they say a single word. Casting, in Spielberg's hands, has never been about who's available or whose name moves a trailer. It has always been about finding the exact person whose gravity pulls the audience into a story they wouldn't otherwise believe. And across his career in Hollywood, he has found that person 6 times with a precision that borders on the uncanny. Tom Hanks entered Spielberg's world not as a movie star looking for prestige, but as a craftsman who happened to fit a very specific mold. Their collaboration stretches across Saving Private Ryan, Catch Me If You Can, The Terminal, Bridge of Spies, and The Post. And what ties all 5 projects together isn't the subject matter or the era. It's the quality Hanks brings to every frame without being asked. Spielberg, who rarely works without strong opinions on performance, reportedly gave minimal direction on the set of Saving Private Ryan, sometimes just a nod, sometimes only a whisper, because Hanks had already found the emotional truth of the scene before the camera rolled. That kind of trust between a director and an actor doesn't get built in a single production, and the fact that it held across more than 25 years says something about what each man sees in the other. Hanks once put it plainly: when Spielberg calls, he doesn't ask what the project is, he simply says yes. On The Post, Spielberg described watching Hanks step into the role of Ben Bradley and said it felt like watching a journalistic lion walk into his own newsroom. None of it was theatrical. None of it was designed to impress. Hanks buries the ego entirely, shows up with the material internalized, and gives Spielberg the one thing no amount of technical filmmaking can manufacture: stillness under pressure. Other actors have brought fire to Spielberg's sets, but Hanks brings something harder to find, which is the kind of gravity that keeps a story honest. Daniel Day-Lewis arrived in Spielberg's orbit only once, and the circumstances around that single collaboration reveal more about how Spielberg operates than almost any other story from his career. Day-Lewis, famously selective about every role he accepts, had turned Spielberg down before Lincoln, and it took years of persuasion before he agreed to step into the presidency. By the time he arrived on set, the transformation was complete, and Spielberg later admitted there were moments during production when he genuinely forgot they were making a film. The direction he gave was minimal, not because he was unprepared, but because some performances require space rather than guidance. Spielberg addressed Day-Lewis as Mr. President throughout the shoot, on set and off, not as a theatrical gesture, but because the work demanded that the fiction remain intact. The result earned Day-Lewis an Academy Award, and Spielberg's response to the performance in interviews was quieter than most expected. He didn't direct him. He witnessed him. That kind of restraint from one of Hollywood's most controlling directors is itself a statement. Day-Lewis never returned to Spielberg's orbit after Lincoln, not because anything fractured between them, but because a collaboration that complete doesn't need a sequel. One film, one presidency, and the most decorated director in American cinema walked away saying the experience changed how he understood character, pacing, and silence. Harrison Ford came into Spielberg's world through Indiana Jones, and what followed across 4 adventure films was one of the most reliable creative partnerships in the history of action cinema. Ford was already Han Solo when Spielberg cast him as the archaeologist with the whip, but what Spielberg saw went beyond the swagger. He told reporters that Ford carries confidence into a room, and that when the camera rolls, the confidence becomes myth. The shoots across the Indiana Jones franchise were physically demanding and frequently brutal in pace, and Ford, rather than stepping back from the danger, leaned into it. On the set of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, when the question of a stunt came up, Ford reportedly told Spielberg directly, "If I get hurt, you'll know it was worth it." That line captures something essential about what Ford has always offered, which is complete physical and emotional commitment to the material, delivered without noise or negotiation. Spielberg has said that Ford provides authenticity on demand, whether the scene requires physical danger, dry humor, or raw grief, and that he remains the only actor he'd consider for the lead of another adventure film. Ford doesn't try to own the frame, and that's exactly what makes him impossible to replace inside it. Leonardo DiCaprio joined Spielberg's world at a very specific moment in his career, just after Titanic had turned him into a global phenomenon. And what Spielberg recognized wasn't the star, it was the scalpel underneath the charm. Catch Me If You Can required an actor who could carry charisma on the surface and desperate loneliness underneath it simultaneously. And DiCaprio delivered both without letting either one overtake the other. Spielberg later described DiCaprio's process on that production as unlike anything he'd encountered from a young actor, noting that he read scenes like maps, asked questions no one else had thought to raise, and never let the weight of a major production visibly rattle him. Frank Abagnale, as DiCaprio played him, wasn't simply a gifted conman. He was a broken teenager in an impeccably constructed disguise, and Spielberg leaned into that emotional core rather than the spectacle. The performance redefined DiCaprio publicly in a way that Titanic, for all its scale, never quite managed, and Spielberg was the director who made that turn feel earned. The two have discussed future projects over the years, a Howard Hughes film among others, but the timing never aligned. What remained was Spielberg calling DiCaprio's work in The Revenant devastating in interviews, and describing him as one of the few actors who can carry chaos in his eyes and silence in his voice at the same moment. One film together, and it still reads as unfinished business. Meryl Streep worked with Spielberg for the first time in 2017 on The Post, joining the production late as it moved fast to match a political moment. And what Spielberg encountered on set apparently caught him off guard in ways he hadn't anticipated. He described the experience of directing her as conducting a symphony with a single instrument, noting that she didn't overact, she undercut, and that every breath and glance arrived timed to a precision he'd previously associated only with Daniel Day-Lewis. Streep's portrayal of Washington Post publisher Katharine Graham earned her a 21st Academy Award nomination. But the more telling detail is how Spielberg described her afterward. Not as great, not as excellent, but as essential to cinema, which is a different category of praise entirely. He admitted openly that he felt nervous directing her, something he'd rarely acknowledged about any actor in his career. The collaboration lasted one film, but Spielberg has repeatedly said he would abandon other commitments to work with her again, and that the memory of her eyes on that set stayed with him. For a director whose entire craft is built on knowing exactly what he wants, saying that someone surprised him is the highest compliment he knows how to give. Robin Williams gave Spielberg something no one else on this list provided, which was not a performance that changed a film, but a presence that kept a director from breaking apart during one of the hardest productions of his life. Hook arrived bloated, behind schedule, and emotionally exhausting, and Williams, who understood what Spielberg was carrying, called him every night after shooting ended, not to talk about the movie, but to spend 15 minutes doing improvised comedy with no audience except one overwhelmed director who needed to laugh. Spielberg has been clear that the film didn't turn out the way he'd hoped, that it was too large and too loose. But what stayed with him had nothing to do with the box office. Williams turned the role of Peter Pan into something adult and aching, a story about the cost of forgetting who you were, and the sadness he brought to it felt personal in a way that couldn't have been directed into existence. Their friendship continued long after the production ended, and when Williams died, Spielberg delayed work on another project to process the loss. He described Williams as lightning in a bottle and said that when he left, the room simply got dimmer. Working with Williams only once didn't diminish the impact, because some people leave a shape in the air that doesn't dissolve after the credits roll. What connects these 6 actors isn't genre or era or even the specific quality of any single performance. What connects them is that each one gave Spielberg something he couldn't manufacture through direction, lighting, or editing. They gave him reflection, the sense that the story he was telling was being held by someone who understood its weight completely. Spielberg doesn't choose by noise or by reputation alone. He chooses by gravity, by that quality in a performer that makes the audience stop calculating and start believing. The names on this list aren't there because they're the 6 best actors of their generation, though most of them are. They're there because each one, in their own way, made a Spielberg film feel like something that couldn't have existed without them specifically. And in a career built on specificity, that is the only criterion that has ever mattered.